Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session among the insurgents, in which we're going to discuss the challenges the media face on reporting on insurgencies around the world. And I'm delighted to be joined today on stage by three of the leading experts in this field. On my right is Cathy Scott-Clark, who's an award-winning investigative journalist and filmmaker who has reported from all over the world, notably for The Guardian and the Sunday Times. And her new book, The Exile, written with Adrian Levy, is a detailed narrative account of bin Laden's biography from 9/11 until his killing 10 years later in Pakistan, which is based on the testimony of senior al-Qaeda leaders and bin Laden family members. Michael Vatikiotis is the only one of us who isn't a journalist, or rather he's a reformed journalist. He's a former editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, and for the past 14 years or so has been Asia director of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which helps to try to resolve armed conflicts throughout Southeast Asia. His new book, Blood and Silk, is a personal and political account of the recent history of his adopted homeland. And Peter Bergen is one of the world's leading experts on al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism. He was the producer of the first ever TV interview with Osama bin Laden in 1997, so in some ways it's all his fault. He's written or edited 7 books on the subject, and including his latest, which is called United States of Jihad. He's also a documentary producer, a professor, a think tank executive, and CNN's national security analyst. Please welcome our panel, ladies and gentlemen. So I thought we might start with you, Michael. And maybe try and define the terms of what we're discussing today. This word insurgent is used quite a lot, and often it refers to the defining international story of our times, if you like, which is violent jihadism. But it's not restricted to that, is it? I mean, and particularly in Southeast Asia, there are numerous insurgencies of different types. Can you give us a kind of flavour of what insurgency means to you and who these insurgents are?
Thank you, Charlie. And actually, it's a very good question to start off with, because there's a lot of confusion around the terminology. And that confusion has political implications. Because when you refer to someone casually as a militant or a radical or an extremist, it then becomes impossible or difficult to engage with them. Insurgents, it's a sort of a neutral term because it sort of implies that this is a non-state actor in a subnational context fighting a government for, say, freedom or autonomy. But most often, it's very easy, especially for governments, to slip into the habit of referring to people as militants, extremists. I love the way that the government of India refers to its various violent insurgencies as outfits, miscreants. But I think the terminology is sensitive, and I just like to call them rebels. You're dealing with rebels. There's an Indian journalist who's written a wonderful book called Rendezvous with Rebels, which I would much like to have as a title. So yes, it's an important question, and I think we should call them generally insurgents, because insurgents implies people who've picked up arms and have chosen the path of violence to address grievances. The complicating factor, especially in my part of the world in Southeast Asia, particularly since 9/11, is that many respectable insurgencies have become the context for or have been exploited by what you would call extremists, those with an agenda that is essentially one of violence perpetrated in the name of some form of extreme ideology. And a very good example of this is something that's happened recently in the Philippines, in the southern Philippines, where you've had, since the mid-1960s, a long-running ethnic insurgency with the Moro Muslim people of Mindanao have been fighting for autonomy and some would say even independence, or more autonomy for their island. And as the government has failed to address this situation, Mindanao has become a lawless place with lots of guns, and into that have come opportunists from the Middle East, from other parts of Southeast Asia. In fact, the Philippines, even before 9/11, was the place where some of the Al-Qaeda plotters had thought to try and start their spectacular terrorism by blowing up a group. You probably know, Peter, the plot to blow up the airliners. And so what we saw last year from May until more or less November was a group of militants who took over a sizable city called Marawi, completely occupied the city, reduced it to rubble. And if you look at the pictures of Marawi today, it looks like sort of Raqqa in Syria, and they did so in the name of IS. But in fact, the people who took over the city, they have a genuine grievance, and so the whole thing has fused together with extremism. So that's why it's a very important question to ask, and we have to be very, very careful about terminology.
That's a very good point. Often, effectively, people we call insurgents are adopting a cause that has some legitimacy and subverting it for their own means. Is that your view as well, Peter? I mean, does that echo with you?
It's very interesting. During the Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the U.S. Secretary of Defense, fought back on the use of the word insurgency for about a year, for the reasons that Michael sort of outlined. It's a neutral term. It implies that the people involved in this may have legitimate grievances. And if you go back to that time in the 2003-2004 time frame, Donald Rumsfeld was referring to them as dead-enders. Now, this had a serious impact on the way that the United States fought a war, because if you conceive of a war as not being an insurgency, as something else, you're not going to fight a counterinsurgency, which is a whole other kind of war than, say, a conventional war, which is how the United States went into Iraq. So misunderstanding your enemy by trying to portray them as something other than they aren't certainly had very bad consequences for the United States. And the United States only really began talking about a real insurgency in 2005, 2 years into the war, and only really had a plan to deal with the insurgency beginning in 2007. So I think the way we frame these issues is quite important.
Let's move on now to you, Cathy. I mean, one of the hardest things for those of us who have been involved in trying to report these issues is, of course, the danger of for the actual reporter themselves. And I think since IS became a power in the Middle East, journalists have been deliberately targeted, and the list of those who've been killed on these stories is now very long. Your book is an incredibly detailed account. I mean, it tells you what expressions people were wearing when they walked out of the room. It's an extraordinary narrative. How did you get that kind of material? How did you operate in this rather dangerous world?
First of all, I'd just like to say, I think on the issue of insurgency, something that Peter picked up on, which is that it is really important to try and understand your enemy, and that's why myself and Adrian, wanted to write the book about inside Al-Qaeda and inside Bin Laden's organisation, and talk to Shura members. The beginning point was, is this possible? Initially, I became very interested because I was working in Pakistan at the time that Osama bin Laden was killed, and his wives and children were taken into custody by the ISI and were being held somewhere in Islamabad, and no one knew where. And I became very fascinated and really wanted to hear kind of the other side of the story, because we'd heard, we quite soon after saw Zero Dark 30, and we heard from some of the Navy SEALs who claimed to have fired the fatal shot in bin Laden's bedroom, but nothing at all from the other witnesses to that scene, so the wives and the children. And that was the starting point. Slightly more accessible place than trying to go to Syria or Saudi Arabia. And I was able to contact the family through the brother of the youngest wife, who had come from Yemen to try and get his sister out of ISI detention, and he didn't speak any language apart from Arabic, and the family had clubbed together and spent all their money on his flight to Islamabad. So he was flailing around and not really knowing what to do. So we assisted him a little bit. We wrote a piece in the Sunday Times highlighting the fact that they were being held illegally and hadn't been produced before a court and were being not tortured but heavily interrogated. And so that was how we kind of first got into the story and started thinking about trying to write a book. But just writing a book on the basis of what sort of wives and children remember of those years with Osama, I could see would not be enough, because, I mean, they lived a very closed, although they saw the interior world of Osama, they lived a very closed life and were not party to, obviously, to Shura meetings and decisions about attacks. So we needed to broaden it out a bit. And so we drew up a very short list of Al-Qaeda Shura members who were not dead and were not in Guantanamo and who might be willing to meet Western journalists. And to cut a long story short, the first person that I met was the spiritual advisor to bin Laden, who ran the Sharia Council for Al-Qaeda, and he had just escaped, in fact, from Iran after being in Iran for 10 years with most of bin Laden's family, who were not in Pakistan. And I was very nervous about going to see him because I couldn't quite believe he'd agreed to say yes. He'd agreed to meet a female reporter who didn't speak Arabic, who was not of Muslim origin at all. And he said, yes, if you can come to Mauritania, which is where he was from, and meet me in Nouakchott, I will meet you and talk to you. And I was supposed to...
So you met him in a cafe or like a hotel?
No. I mean, the arrangement was done through a Mauritanian journalist who'd interviewed him for an Arab channel, and the Mauritanian journalist was supposed to come with me because I didn't even know where Nouakchott was. The Mauritanian journalist cancelled 2 days before the trip. I'd agreed to pay for his flight because he was based in Doha, and he'd cancelled. And this is in the middle of all the beheadings in Syria of journalists like James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. And I certainly didn't want to end up in that kind of situation, so I was very, very nervous about going. But in the end, I decided to go, and we put together a very pathetic security plan that I would ring Adrian, who is in London, and tell him which part of town I was going to when I met the man who I was to ring on arrival. And I was going to give an address and details of our kind of car registration. And so the person arrived at my hotel who was going to escort me to Mahfouz's house. And I said, where are we going? And he said, we're going to the 17th pylon in Yasser Arafat district. And I said, well, can you show me on a map where that is? And he said, no, we don't have any maps. I mean, Nouakchott, if anyone's been there, is just dust and sand and camels and a lot of people. And we drove out of the hotel precinct in a very battered old car, which didn't have a number plate, at which point my phone dropped out as well. So the security plan went completely wrong, even before I'd got anywhere. But anyhow, we went to this person's house, and I was still, even as he opened the door, I was half expecting it to be someone else or some horrible kidnapping attempt. But it was him, and he was a fascinating character. And I went on to spend 3 trips and 3 weeks talking to him about his memories of Osama.
Fascinating.
On security plans, you're absolutely right, Cathy, that given everything that's happened to journalists, and especially what's happened in Syria, I remember reading about the German fellow who had applied for and I think did see IS, and using a particular form of chutzpah that I thought was incredible. I mean, it just sort of, I want to speak to you, but apart from that, my experience of actually officially contacting some of these rebel groups is that they very often crave the same sort of spaces that you inhabit. They want to meet in expensive hotels. They want to have the buffet lunch. They want the all expenses. They want to use their mileage or acquire their mileage and fly business class and so on. And so I often think that at the leadership level, we're dealing with people who really have the same kind of preoccupations that politicians have, and the same kinds of egos. in a slightly more shadowy world. Now, in Southeast Asia, many of these rebel groups, they may be operating on the ground in an underground form, but their leaders are very often hiding in plain sight or living in separate places. I mean, famously, of course, in Aceh, the head of the Aceh Freedom, what was called the Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, the Aceh Freedom Movement, was working in a post office in Sweden. One of the other rebel groups that I've dealt with in Thailand also lives in Sweden and has a comfortable job as a bus driver. And so there is this sort of sense in which, to some extent, the leadership of these traditional liberation movements, which are not classified necessarily as terrorist groups. And I think that's the other point to make, is that in the world of rebels that I inhabit, there's this great fear of being listed. Because if you're listed, so like the Tamil Tigers were listed, actually the communist movement of the Philippines is listed as a terrorist organization by the United States government. It actually limits your travel. You can't travel around and go to the meeting of unregistered peoples in The Hague and so on and so forth. So there is that kind of, at the leadership level, often a very sort of a preoccupation with status and with comforts, while their followers are fighting on the ground, often in very difficult conditions.
Just pick up on one thing.
Sure, yeah.
On two things on that. Adrian reminded me this morning of a story from a long time ago when we were working in Burma, and we were going to do an interview with the leader of the Shan State Army, Yordzerk, and we'd hired a crappy four-wheel drive in Chiang Mai and drove it up to the border point where we were meeting him. And he said, oh, nice to meet you, and sort of, you go off with my guys and I'll see you later. And we didn't see him for about 4 days, and he went off in our four-wheel drive. Anyhow, when we finally got it back about a week later, the clock had gone up by something like 1,500 kilometres, and he'd just been tooling around on the border using this flashy but not very good four-wheel drive.
I have another story about General Yordzerk, but I'll leave that till later.
Peter, just to broaden out the discussion slightly, there's a quote actually from Clive Stafford Smith, the human rights lawyer, on the jacket of your new book, Cathy, which says, the West spends far too little time trying to understand those who attacked on 9/11, and if we do not understand them, we will never combat their ideology. Do you think the media, Peter, explains well enough these issues, or does it portray them too easily in black and white terms?
I mean, what is the media? Let's start there. I mean, it's sort of it's the New York Times, it's the Sun newspaper in the United Kingdom, it's CNN, it's Fox, there's no media. Let's start there. I mean, there's lots of different, there's a Hindustan Times here, and there's Z TV, and I mean, so let me start. I mean, I think that is actually a nonsensical statement from Clive Stafford Smith. Is a smart guy, and he's a very admirable lawyer. But the idea that we're sitting on this stage as like people who've spent 15 years trying to explain these groups, and of course people can come away with caricatures, and I started reporting on this phenomenon in 1993 when I first went to Afghanistan, and there were a group of Arabs who were gathering there who seemed to want to take the jihad elsewhere. So of course, life is imperfect, and bad journalism happens. But I think there's been quite a lot of good journalism. I mean, look at Adrian and Cathy's book. I mean, it's very authoritative, and so I kind of just don't agree.
Sure. I guess one point to make is that part of this kind of global war, if you can call it that, is propaganda, and quite often you see relatively small acts of terrorism that are given enormous coverage, and it particularly it's happened in the UK, and it happens in the US, and so these things are talked up. I mean, there's a very good point in your book where you talk about the number of people in America who are killed in car accidents compared with the number who've been killed by violent terrorism, and I think the statistic is that you're 12,000 times more likely to die in a car accident in the States than you are in a terrorist attack.
Well, let me give you an even better statistic. You're 3,000 times more likely to be killed by a fellow American citizen with a gun in the United States than you are to be killed by a terrorist. And, because of the gun because of the gun culture in the United States, that there was a moment, the Orlando attack was the most deadly attack in American terrorist attack since 9/11. 49 people were killed in a gay nightclub in Orlando. Now, there was legislation in Congress called No Fly, No Buy, which is if you're too dangerous to get onto an American plane, you're not allowed to buy semi-automatic weapons. And it shows you the power of the National Rifle Association in America. This legislation didn't pass. I mean, it makes no sense. So people who are banned from American flights are perfectly able to buy semi-automatic weapons. And Omar Mateen perfectly legally bought 4 semi-automatic weapons, killed 49 people. But let me get to the question about terrorism in the media. It's a cliche. Maggie Thatcher famously said in 1985 that the oxygen of terrorism is the media. And she basically implying the media shouldn't cover acts of terrorism. Well, this is a totally ridiculous concept because terrorism these are big news stories. I mean, do the thought experiment where 9/11 wasn't covered or the 7/7 attacks in London. I mean, it makes no sense. Now, the problem here is that we are not rational human beings. We're still walking around with the brain we had 20,000 years ago in the jungle, which was very useful for survival there. So fear is completely embedded in our personality. So even though it's obviously irrational to fear terrorism, lots of people do. And let's have a show of hands if anybody's concerned about terrorism as an issue. Well, you're all very rational. But most people, when you look at polling data, people tend to be very concerned about it, which makes no sense. On the other hand, that is, and one of the reasons Donald Trump, by the way, won the presidency, when you look at exit polling, the people who are most concerned about terrorism overwhelmingly voted for him, even though Hillary Clinton probably would have been a much superior president on every level, including in this area. So anyway, I'm not making an excuse. I mean, I think we have to cover it because these are news stories. I mean, there may be sometimes people who kind of are hyperventilate about it and blah blah blah, but it makes no sense to say we should not cover the Paris attacks in 2015 where 130 people were killed because somehow it gives oxygen to these groups. Yes, it does, but also you can't ignore these attacks.
Okay, well, let's move away.
There's another point.
Sorry,
there.
Michael, yeah, go on.
There's another point there which is even more important than perhaps the media not being able to cover or having this this problem, this obstacle of the word terrorism. There's also, for me, in what I do, there's this great difference in terms of the ability to engage. The view of governments is you should not talk to extremists, terrorists, militants, radicals, that they're not to be engaged with. They're beyond the pale. And it's the thing that I battle with a lot. I mean, an extremely good example right now is the emergence of this Rohingya armed group, ASA. Here is a people who have the most obvious grievance. And if ever there was a people who felt to get up one day and say, well, maybe we should turn to the armed struggle, I mean, this would be one. And yet the moment they've turned to the armed struggle, and then there's this great fear that they may be hooking up with Islamic radicals from the Middle East, IS linked and so on, that's when governments start to say, no, you shouldn't engage with these people. It's too late. They've been infected. And yet the grievance hasn't changed. And the options they have are still limited. And it's, ASA is actually an organization that's trying very hard to engage with the international community to demonstrate that they're interested in following norms and values and that they are concerned about being infected by Islamic extremists and radicals. And so if we can't have a conversation with them, and if you can't engage with them, then you're never really going to be able to pull them into a world of considering what their concerns are that eventually leads to some sort of dialogue.
But in a lot of cases, there is no dialogue, is there? I mean, certain groups are beyond the pale, and
don't believe that at all. That's complete nonsense.
You don't believe that's happening?
Absolutely. There is no one that cannot be convinced to come into a room and talk to you.
I totally agree with you. And just to add to that.
Sorry, I wasn't saying that I don't think there should be dialogue. I'm saying that there is no current dialogue with some groups. Do you think that's true?
IS would be a good example. IS has chosen to talk to us through the media, through their online platforms. I'm not the one to comment on this. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon that there is actually a discourse through the media. I think that we've chosen, as a result, to sort of stay away from... there are people who do talk to IS, but it's mostly about local agreements, local ceasefires, local arrangements on the ground, not the larger issue, because it is difficult to talk to them about their larger issue, I would agree. But nonetheless, I think you have to engage, and you have to find some way of finding a pathway into the leadership or into the people that control the guns to start to have a discussion about the way out, the exit.
Cathy?
Just two points, short points I'd like to make. Firstly, I totally agree that you have to have discussions because even, I'm not an apologist for Al-Qaeda, but even the origins of Al-Qaeda have arguments and concerns about situations in the world that do need to be resolved, like Palestine. And unless that kind of thing is addressed, then it will continue. I mean, there has to be some kind of discussion. In terms of kind of the oxygen of giving them publicity, I think it's quite a difficult one because Bin Laden was all about publicity. I mean, he fed off the media.
Well, there's a wonderful bit in your book where you talk about his making the video after 9/11, and he's changes his clothes, I think, or puts a new hat on several times. He chooses the location where it's going to be shot. He has a particular guy write the speech that he's going to make to frame it in religious terms.
Yes, I mean that was a slightly, one of the characters in the book is a slightly kind of sort of Walter Mitty character in that he was a religious scholar who happened to be in Kandahar, brought over by the Mauritanian, and the Mauritanian had resigned from Al-Qaeda because he was against 9/11. So Bin Laden was left without his religious sidekick, which he always had to have whenever he was making a speech or presenting something or talking to the Shura or doing a video. So Suleiman Abu Ghaith, who was the man who was sort of brought in at the last minute to be the religious scholar at his left-hand side, really found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. But yes, I mean, it's all about presentation. It's all about wearing the right clothes. I mean, for Bin Laden, it was all about how he looked and his physical beauty and his height and his soft voice. I mean, you've met him. I mean, it's all about the charisma. But in terms of the ideas and the arguments behind what Al-Qaeda stood for, that was done by people behind him.
And I guess it's a two-sided battle. I mean, we talked briefly about Zero Dark 30 and the impression that gave of the killing of Bin Laden. I mean, Peter, do you think the West, as well as the jihadists, if you like, are involved in a propaganda battle?
Yeah, of course, but I mean that's almost a tautology. I mean, to say terrorists are very interested in propaganda or they're getting their message out. I mean, you can't think of any form of human activity where that isn't true now, right? So everybody has a social media strategy. Everybody has a media strategy. I mean, just like this is just how life is. So it's not. It doesn't really say much to say that they have this strategy. I mean, of course they do, but so does every other sort of entity. But I think what is new is terrorism has sort of merged with the media. So, the media operation for these groups, is very sensitive to the fact that Facebook Live. You can now. What we're going to see in the next really big catastrophic terrorist attack, and we've seen this beginning to develop over time. You may recall the Westgate, Kenya mall attack. It was live tweeted by people who understood a lot more about what was going on inside that mall. People inside Shabab, and they're actually much more useful information than the Kenyan government. And that was the first time that where a significant terrorist attack was essentially being covered live by people who were, and putting out the message. So they don't need the conventional media. And then we've seen sort of evolutions of that. So when Omar Mateen killed 49 people in Orlando, he pledged on Facebook his pledge of allegiance to the leader of ISIS. We saw a policeman being killed live on Facebook Live by an ISIS sort of self-recruit. And so in the next big attack, then this will pose huge dilemmas for conventional broadcasters and also for the social media companies. It will be covered live, but in lots of different forms. Because we've already begun to see it, and that, let's say a Paris attack that was entirely covered live by the 8 people who carried out the attack, who were using, let's say, GoPro cameras that were, this is going to happen.
But to look again more positively at what you can do by engaging with them and using this kind of outreach, if you want to call the media outreach, is to actually, and this is something that I find myself doing a lot, is there's the path of violence and there's the utility of violence. Often in some groups, the use of violence is a recruitment tool. It's a way of bringing people in, and as we've seen with much of the discussion about the recruitment of ISIS, that the use that they made of the sort of almost the snuff movies that they made for the web was to draw people in, the thrill of violence, in addition to the ideological indoctrination. In the southern Philippines, the group that took over Marawi, they didn't indoctrinate their recruits with a Salafist sort of Islamic ideology. They promised them iPads, music players, and the thrill of violence. You get to use a heavy automatic weapon. You might even get to kill people. And the indoctrination came later. So I think that's very important. And so the antidote to that is not to sort of go, oh, we can't have anything to do with them. It's to actually convince the leadership of the clever way in which you can use media and outreach to have a political strategy. Because often the opposing forces are not very smart politically either. And if you can somehow persuade these people who generally have generally have a genuine grievance, and are people who are willing to follow them, but if you can turn that into a political strategy, it turns them somewhat away from the path of violence.
Yes, Peter. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, picking up on this question of violence. I mean, the Nazis went to great lengths to conceal their war crimes. ISIS went to great lengths to broadcast them globally. And this was part of their appeal. There were two kind of elements of the appeal. There was the extreme violence against the Shia. And then also, there was another thing that we don't often sort of see in the West, which was essentially a portrait of a Islamic utopia with, they were issuing license plates to ISIS. ISIS had its own license plates. They had all people's homes. And then basically they would sort of show all this to show, yeah, we have created an Islamic utopia, and that's the reason that so many thousands of Muslims went there. It wasn't just the violence, which was very attractive to some of the young men who certainly weren't necessarily Islamic scholars. What classic example is this German rapper who just got killed. He's been said to be dead a number of times, but it seems this may be true. He was kind of a no-hoper in Germany who was a rap star who converted to Islam and basically was like a thug. So the violence was very attractive for those guys. But then for the women who came, I think the idea of maybe finding your perfect mate, which was part of this, and also for a lot of Muslims, or the 40,000 who came from around the world, this idea that we were really coming to this Islamic utopia. Of course, that was false, but this was part of the appeal. So it was kind of both violence and this utopian message.
Everything that you've been saying reminds me of Pakistan, and we did a lot of work at one stage with people who in Swat Valley. The army ran a slightly dubious suicide bomber de-radicalization school, and we interviewed quite a lot of the kids who'd been picked up. The reason the army had set up this school was because they'd got caught shooting at point-blank range some teenagers who they'd kind of picked up during the SWAT offensive. So they had to make a bit of an effort to look like they were helping the local community. But there was a common factor with all of the kids who they'd pulled in, which was that they were young village children whose fathers were invariably away working in places like Dubai, and had very little education, had barely gone to mosque, and had been pulled in, like you say, by the kind of the excitement and the glamour of being in a pickup with an AK-47 and being told that you're going to go to paradise and be martyred. It's the best possible way to kind of go and take all your relatives with you. And I interviewed the person who was the most interesting person at the de-radicalization school was a religious scholar who was subsequently killed by the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban. And he said that the level of education, the religious knowledge of these boys who'd been picked up on the way to blowing themselves up was shockingly not there. They'd just been given wrong information. They'd been misinformed about the nature of Islam, and his job was to try and sort of start again and take away the sort of misnomers and give them some proper education. But yes, it was all about the glamour. It's more interesting than sitting around in a village square with no future, no jobs, and no nothing.
Yeah, which leads us on to the kind of question of, I guess, who are the insurgents? In your book, Peter, I think you say you might as well ask the question, who drives a Volvo? They can be absolutely anybody. But then there's also a feeling that certainly the senior commanders tend to be drawn from the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I mean, there's an important distinction between terrorist groups and insurgencies. Terrorists tend to be volunteers. You can't pay somebody to commit suicide. Terrorist groups look at Bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda. He's an Egyptian surgeon, comes from an upper middle class Egyptian family. Bin Laden went to the best high school in Saudi Arabia, the best university. What comes from the richest families in the Middle East. So terrorist groups in general, they're kind of it's a bourgeois endeavor. Terrorism, it turns out, but insurgencies, because you have foot soldiers, tend to be, as Cathy was saying. I mean, I've interviewed failed suicide bombers in jail in Afghanistan. There's no bigger failure than being a failed suicide bomber, and they tend to be they're goat herds who are aged 16. They know nothing of the world, and so when you're running an insurgency like the Taliban or ISIS, where you have an army, they're on the payroll. They're not volunteers. They're getting $150 a month if they're in ISIS, or the similar kind of fee if they're in the Taliban. This requires a lot of money. So in the Taliban case, it's basically being the largest drug dealer in the region. In the case of ISIS, it was extortion, taxation, kidnapping, antiquities smuggling, and oil revenues. So probably ISIS at one point was the richest terrorist group in history. But so it's important for us. Insurgents often use terrorist tactics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're kind of a classic terrorist group. And so, as you've been saying about in Southeast Asia, I mean, Abu Sayyaf, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the Philippines, is really a kind of classic terrorist organization, whereas some of these other Filipino groups, the Moro Liberation Front, I mean, these are much bigger enterprises. So it's important to make these distinctions.
And it's also important to try to get away from this notion that all insurgents and terrorists are somehow Muslim groups, infected by radical sort of hardline conservative Islam. There are vast landscapes of conflict in this continent of Asia that are essentially ethno-nationalist groups, people who are minorities, who since the dawn of nationhood have never really been given a chance to assert their autonomy. I mean, India, of course, is a major landscape of conflict in the northeast, and their beef goes right back to the independence of India and the arrangements that were not made on their behalf. Myanmar, Burma, has the largest single landscape of conflict, I think, of any particular country, given that little more than a third or more of the country has been involved in civil wars with the central government of Myanmar since independence. So 70 years of civil war. Very well established ethnic armies, some of whom hold territory, control local government, or at least have arrangements with the army about what is controlled and what is not controlled, with an extremely successful conflict economy. Nothing to do with any form of ideology, and with young people who have known nothing, I mean generations of people actually, who've known nothing other than to fight for these ethnic armies. I first crossed the border into Burma in 1981, and I was taken across the border to meet, it was actually a Shan group, many years later I started to work on the peace process in Myanmar. This fellow with grey hair comes forward and he says, "Oh, I'm Colonel Oka." I said, "I know, you were the one who took me, you were young, so they've been at it for generations, or, all their lives." It's not about ideology. Similarly, in the Philippines, there is, in addition to what you described, which is the sort of ethnic nationalist struggle, there's also a very long tradition of clan conflict, of criminality. There's so many guns in the Philippines, that it's a way of life, and that's how you make money. I mean, in fact, the way in which many of these people, Abu Sayyaf has been making money is kidnapping ransom. And so you kidnap a European, you can make $2-3 million. And that's enough to run an insurgent group, for 2 or 3 years. So it's a business as well.
And how do you, as a negotiator going into these situations, how do you persuade people to break this cycle? I mean, what are your arguments?
There are two tried and tested methods. I mean, obviously, you as a person have to win their trust, and that's often very, very difficult because they immediately see you as working for the government, the other side. You've been sent by the government, or even if you're talking to the government, you must be working for them. So you really have to win their trust, and that's often very hard, and it does take a particular kind of individual and empathy, and it often takes a very long time. But the second process is rather more mundane and rather technical. What you do is you bring people who've come in, who've worked for or fought for insurgencies that have either succeeded or ended with an agreement, and you say, look, why don't you meet this guy from the IRA? He'll tell you what it was like, the armed struggle. It'll also tell you what it was like to end the armed struggle. And that's become a bit of a cottage industry. We're going to see now a lot of Colombian FARC, former guerrillas and maybe military people come out of Colombia, fan out around the world and say, this is how we did it. It is effective. It does actually help people think through, insurgent organizations, it helps them think through their political options. And everyone likes to share experiences and learn from that. And so, while it's an industry, it's also an effective one.
I mean, that's interesting because it offers there is a way out. Can I perhaps ask you all to kind of get your crystal balls out and see what you think the future of these stories is going to be in the next 5-10 years? Peter, would you like to speculate about that?
There was an American baseball player who called Yogi Berra, who famously said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And so, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think we can say, the situation in the Middle East, ISIS is not the problem. ISIS is a symptom of deeper problems in the Middle East, which aren't going away, unless there's a political settlement in Syria, unless there is a political accommodation for the Sunnis in Iraq, unless there is peace in Yemen, unless there is a stable government in Libya. We're going to continue to see this cycle of a son of ISIS and a grandson of ISIS. It may not be as effective. ISIS at the height of its power controlled territory the size of the United Kingdom and population the size of Switzerland. So that was a pretty good outcome. Most terrorist groups don't succeed to that degree. But peace in Syria is highly unlikely. The RAND Corporation looked at 88 insurgencies since World War II. On average, they last 10 years. That's the minimum, and they can go up to 14 years. Michael just mentioned the FARC. That went on for half a century. And so, the one way the Syrian civil war can end, which it already has, is Assad simply wins. But the fact is, we're going to see the Yemen war has gone. Yemen is one of the poorest state in the Arab world. It's gone from a failing state to a totally failed state as a result of the Saudi Arabian incursion into Yemen. Libya has two governments. I mean, so this is going to churn, and then you add to that the Muslim immigration to Europe and the kind of alienation of Muslims in Europe, the rise of proto-fascist, ultra-nationalist parties in Europe, which are kind of amplifying all this, and then add social media. I mean, this is a very toxic mix. The United States is somewhat insulated from this by geography and ideology because we have an American dream, which has worked pretty well for American Muslims. They're well integrated. Interestingly, I find it's very interesting that in India, there are so few ISIS recruits, given the size of the Muslim population. So in a country that's sort of built on the idea of, some form of, acceptance of other, you're going to see less of this. But in countries like France, where there's really not an acceptance of the other, they're going to be French citizens who will self-recruit whatever the next thing is. So, I hate to sort of paint this pessimistic picture, but I'm not by nature a pessimist, but I am quite concerned, and really for the Middle East, it's just, this is going to grind on forever. Cathy is writing, and Adrian are writing a new book about the Saudis. The people who could unscrew this, the Saudis and the Iranians, are amplifying it. The new king of, that's a Freudian slip, the new crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he executed this guy, Nimr al-Nimr, who's a leading Shia cleric, really for nothing. And so he's making it worse, and he instigated this, catastrophic invasion of Yemen, which has caused the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now, where millions of people face starvation and cholera. So, the politics around this don't suggest that there's going to be some magic, kumbaya.
And the US politics perhaps as well.
What's that?
The US politics perhaps as well. How do you think that will affect?
Meaning what?
Meaning the arrival of your new president.
In what sense?
his promises to ban Muslim countries traveling to the
Yeah,
States.
I mean, that was, a total waste of time. But it was a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist, because all these countries that were banned, none of these people have conducted lethal terrorist attacks. In America, all the lethal terrorist attacks are carried out by American citizens or American legal residents. Major Nidar Hassan, who was an Army major in the American Army, was born in Arlington, Virginia, and killed 13 people at Fort Hood, and there were multiple other examples. But I think that won't have a big effect. I mean, Trump has done he amplified the fight against ISIS, that's a good thing. He has increased American commitment to Afghanistan, that's a good thing, because Afghanistan's going to hell in a handbasket, and it needs, some long-term sort of support. Some of the things he's done have not been unhelpful. The travel ban is just, a total waste of time, won't achieve any of its goals, and just pisses people off.
I would very much agree with Peter, and I'm sure Cathy will chime in on this as well, that the biggest threat to managing the growth of these insurgencies, particularly on the Islamic side, is the gargantuan struggle that has now become one of the most important geopolitical divides and struggles of our era, which is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In Southeast Asia, which is far away from both countries, the Saudis have spent upwards of $100 billion globally to pressure and to use their education system to make sure that Muslim communities, high and low, adhere to a particularly conservative form of Islam that is exclusive and exclusive, and tends to go against the grain of the sort of familiar, tolerant forms of Islam that we're more accustomed to in this region. As I learned when I was first a journalist in Indonesia, this all began with Saudi Arabia's great fear that the Iranian Revolution in 1979 would somehow be very appealing to young people. And they launched this great education campaign, which has now become such an important driver, not so much of insurgency and terrorism, but in changing the shapes of societies, Muslim societies. And that's even, in many ways, more insidious than a terrorist group that can be identified, a small number of people committing violence. I mean, I remember there was a terrorist attack, a rather sort of silly and ill-conceived terrorist attack at Starbucks in Jakarta almost 2 years ago. I mean, the guy was using a gun that didn't work, but they still managed to kill several people and wound people. But at the same time, what people are more concerned about in Indonesia is the deterioration of the traditions of tolerance between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so however many small pinprick terrorist attacks there are, this is the bigger concern. And I believe that's been very much driven over the last few decades by Saudi Arabia's great fear that Iran's revolution could somehow have more appeal. And now we see it manifested very much in the geopolitics of the region and the world. Pakistan is greatly concerned about the Iranian-Saudi divide. India should be. And much of Southeast Asia, the Muslim countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, have a devil of a time fending off the Saudis. We don't want to work to this agenda. And the Iranians, rather more clever and nuanced. They just sort of wait for the Saudis to screw up. But it is a very, very big and palpable threat, and I think we're going to see it driving a lot of the violence. The second point would be in these ungoverned spaces where insurgencies operate, there's the emergence of a very successful conflict economy, using, of course, all the technologies that you have today to be able to do trading and move money around. The landscape of conflict in Myanmar is more or less dominated by the jade trade, the methamphetamines trade, the heroin trade. It's incredibly lucrative. And I was going to raise the story of General Yotsuk, who I once met and asked him about why he doesn't join the peace process in Myanmar. He said, "What would I do with peace? How would I feed my men?" So it's the conflict economies and I think the great sort of geopolitical struggles emerging in the Middle East are very much going to keep us busy, either working with insurgencies or reporting on them.
Yes, I don't think any of us will be out of a job for a long time yet. And in terms of Al-Qaeda, one thing I was very interested to learn was how much the senior members who are still alive are watching all the time other groups. And it is all about kind of who wins not necessarily the PR struggle, but who is at the forefront. And Al-Qaeda have taken obviously a back seat in the last decade, but they haven't gone away. A lot of the senior Shura members have been in Iran, waiting and watching and getting assistance from the Iranians for a much bigger kind of long-term game. Some of them were put into play in Syria in 2015. Other people still remain in Iran, like Saif al-Adil, who is the sort of deputy chairman of al-Qaeda, who's currently waging a bit of a war with Dr. Zawahiri. And they're watching Islamic State, and they're watching how that blows out, and they're making their own long-term strategies and plans based on how other groups are doing. And there are these senior sort of old guard who are still around, but then there's the next generation. So Zawahiri has sort of grabbed hold of Osama's son Hamza, who also has his own children, apart from a son of his called Hamza, called Osama, who was recently killed. And so there are generational, familial relations which are not going to go away. So I think we're going to be busy. And Saudi Arabia does not help. The Crown Prince's activities in the region does not help with stability. And one final thing also is with intolerance. The more we are intolerant and we don't understand other communities, so in the UK with Brexit and in the US with all the ICE roundups, I think that's just making things worse and worse. So people will be encouraged to go off and join groups.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panel for that. We could now, we've got about 10 minutes left or so. We'd like to open it up to the audience. Is there anyone who's got a question for our experts? Yes, there's a lady in black near the back there on the left.
My question is to Mr. Bergen. You were speaking previously about how sometimes, media is accused for, acting as supplying oxygen to all these terror groups and things like that. But, and I actually believe in what you said, that media groups should be covering these events. But have you ever felt that maybe it is required to properly draw a line, that maybe in certain times, too much information can be dangerous in any way,
Yeah, I work at a news station, so people who work at news stations they're only interested in the news. When it's no longer news, they just don't run it. I mean, that's not a perfect answer that everybody might want to hear. Of course, everybody who works they're patriots and they're Americans or they're Indians or whatever, and if they're something in the national interest is very clear that it shouldn't be reported, we don't. So, for instance, it is often the case that American hostages are taken and there's a news blackout because the family, who after all is the family who has the right to make this public, has said we don't want to make it public. And so the news will censor itself in certain legitimate cases. But, generally speaking, people make news judgments, and these are not perfect judgments about what is news. And that's a very subjective thing. That's why, in the United States, a catastrophic event in country 5,000 miles away is less of a big news than a semi-catastrophic event inside the United States. This is how the news business works. I'm not defending it necessarily. I'm just saying I'm making this observation. And it would be I think you're going down a slippery path to say, well, we've covered this too much, and for whatever reason, we're just not going to cover it. I mean, if the news keeps coming out, whenever there's a terrorist attack happens, usually quickly the terrorist attack is identified, then the family, the victims, and you talk to the victims. I mean, there's a whole kind of typical process in these kinds of things, and that's a very legitimate part of the news business, and also it's something the public has an interest in knowing. Both an interest in the classic sense of they're interested, but also an interest because they need to know about something that is going on that is violent in their own community and trying to understand it better.
Yes, sir, in a baseball hat, blue shirt. Or indeed you, that's fine.
Thank you very much. That is, but one thing I would like to ask the panel, that I read somewhere written by Mr. Bill Gates that by 2030s, that this terrorism can vanish out. One thing. The other question is that my personal view is so far a little reading about terrorism and insurgents and whatsoever that opposition, that on behalf of this fight against the governments or any law institution, But I realized that it could be in macro level, that a difference between privileged, rich and poor, or privileged or unprivileged, whether in Africa, in the Middle East. This is my point of view. I would like to little.
I can definitely agree that, leaving aside the sort of issue of Islamic radicalism, most of these insurgencies operate and thrive in marginal places that have been neglected, or where the grievance has never been addressed. And that grievance can be a mixture of nationalism, a local ethnic identity, but also economic marginalization. And I think that that's true. And I often think that, in my business, maybe it would be better if the World Bank spent money on trying to figure out how to bring appropriate levels of not just development, but infrastructure to allow people and give people a choice, so that they can actually take part in a more formal, regular economy, rather than live in these sort of marginal, conflict-ridden economy. One of the greatest threats at the moment to resolving some of these problems is, in fact, the success of the conflict economy. South Sudan is a very good example of this. South Sudan was supposed to be this great example of a country made out of a struggle, where the South, the mostly Christian South, with a whole bunch of rebel armies, establishes itself as a country from the North. It's not it happened, but what's not happening is a stabilization of a situation, because all those rebel armies have their own, to simplify it, have their own access to forms of making money, and they squirrel that money away to the Gulf, and actually the people are not being served. So I think it's both addressing the marginalization and economic deprivation and inequality, but also making sure that the people on the ground, who are often recruited by these insurgencies, are given access and the mobility to tap into the formal economy.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, you, sir, in the hat.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. In most cases, political insurgencies are gaining political mileage in India. So my question is, how to keep political insurgencies a social and an economic touch? Because in India, it is found that political insurgencies are transformed into a vote bank politics. So how to keep insurgencies a socio-economic touch so that the benefits can be trickled down to the grassroots level?
Cathy, do you want to talk about that at all? I think it's a similar question to the last one about inequality and that being a cause of insurgents.
Yes. Well, two things I could say with knowledge. Thinking back to the 2008 attacks in Mumbai, if you look at the Lashkar-e-Toiba guys who were recruited to come over, they came from very marginalised communities where there were no jobs and no futures. And if there had been, and no real kind of Islamic knowledge, and if there had been better opportunities for them, maybe they wouldn't have been recruited and they wouldn't have wanted to come on the boat and kill hundreds of people in Mumbai. And looking at Kashmir, which springs to mind as the most significant political insurgency in India, again, people are totally marginalised. They don't have any opportunities. They're completely cut off from the rest of India by the tunnel which is closed and the flights which are cancelled. So I think until opportunities are given to people in marginal situations, then things won't change.
Absolutely. One more question, and then I think we're going to have to finish. Yes, the mustard top by the aisle there.
My question is to the entire panel today. do you think America is too much into the affairs of other countries?
Peter, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, as the, I think I'm the token American on the panel, so, you know, I mean, the United States is the world's only superpower, and we have sins of commission and omission. I think a classic sin of omission is our lack of activity when it came to Syria, which is the biggest humanitarian crisis, arguably since World War II, with 14 million people displaced and 500,000 dead. And we really didn't do anything of any substance. On the other hand, we also made a very similar mistake in both Iraq and Libya. Bush made the mistake of overthrowing Saddam without a plan for day two. Obama overthrew Gaddafi without a plan for day two in Libya, and chaos ensued. So my answer to that is, yeah, America, you know, we make plenty of mistakes, but often we shouldn't confuse the fact that sometimes actually action by the United States is actually quite helpful. We've seen, you know, if we'd intervened in 2012 in Syria in a more meaningful way, you know, perhaps a lot of people wouldn't have died.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wind it up there. Thank you very much indeed to our panelists and to you for listening. And yes, goodbye.
Thank you so much, Cathy, Michael, Peter, Charlie, for the lovely session on Among the Insurgents. Thank you so much.